Happy Wednesday, everybody. It is NTI day 26, and we are going to be looking at attributes of a 2D shape. So we have been studying different types of angles, and we've been studying different types of lines. Well, now it's time for us to be able to identify those in our 2D shapes that we see every day. So let's go ahead and get started. The first one that we're going to look at is a rectangle. Okay, so on a rectangle over here, I'm going to list the different attributes that it has. But first, you need to know that when it comes to lines and being able to identify lines, you have to remember that lines keep going. They don't just stop once they meet another line. So what I mean by that is, if you look over here, this line keeps going. And then I'm going to rotate this. And this line, it keeps going. Okay, and we know that these two lines together, they form a 90-degree angle. So we can go ahead and say, if we're just looking at angles, it has 4 right angles. We know that because right angles have 90 degrees. And we know that these line segments form 90-degree angles, so that tells us that they are perpendicular lines. So those would be some attributes that a rectangle has. Do you see where we're able to identify that? So you got to think of all your different types of lines, and you got to think of all your different types of angles. So let's go through them. Does it have an acute angle? No. Does it have obtuse angles? No. Does it have right angles? Yes, it has 4 right angles. Okay, so now let's go through our lines. Parallel lines. Does it have parallel lines? It does. It has 2 sets of parallel lines. Right? Intersecting lines? No, not intersecting, because remember, they make a V shape. But it does have perpendicular lines. So those would be our 3 attributes: 4 right angles, perpendicular lines, and 2 set of parallel lines. All right, let's look at a different shape. Okay, so when it comes to the rhombus, it's important to remember that these lines keep going. So if you look, I got my line right there. We'll look at this line specifically. It doesn't just stop once it meets another line like you see in a shape. You have to picture them like they keep on going forever and ever. Lines never stop. Well, let's go through the different types of angles. Does it have acute angles? It does. It has, this is an acute angle. Okay, so let's go ahead and say that it's at least 1 acute angle. Right, and then it looks like this is an obtuse angle right over here. At least 1 obtuse angle. And let's see, it doesn't have any right angles. What about our lines? Well, does it have perpendicular lines? No, because there's no 90-degree angles on a rhombus because it's tilted. Does it have parallel lines? It does. It has 2 sets of parallel lines. I know this because this line will keep going on and on forever. But then if you look at this line, it'll keep going on and on forever, but they're never going to meet. Parallel lines never meet. So this line and this line would be your set of parallel lines, as well as this line and this line right here. They'll never meet. They'll go on forever and ever, and their paths will never cross. Okay, so we've looked at parallel lines, didn't have perpendicular. It does have intersecting lines. Right here, we know that because it makes an acute or an obtuse angle. So we can go ahead and say intersecting lines. Okay, so there's all of our attributes of a rhombus. Okay, let's look at another 2D shape, a hexagon. Remember, hexagons we're able to identify because they have 6 sides. Okay, so let's look at our different lines to help us visualize. This line goes on forever. This line will go on forever. You have this line. Rotate it. I'm going to go ahead and move a line down here because this is going to be really important that we can see the relationship between these 2 lines. Okay. All right, let's go through our different types of angles. Do we see any right angles? I don't see any right angles, but I definitely see a lot of obtuse angles. So I'm going to go ahead and put at least one obtuse angle. Okay, what about acute angles? I don't see any acute angles. They're all obtuse. Don't see any right angles. Okay, let's go on to lines. Parallel lines. I do see a set of parallel lines. This line and this line is parallel. Intersecting lines. We definitely see intersecting lines because we know that we had an acute or an obtuse angle. Intersecting lines. Okay, and then perpendicular lines. If we don't have a right angle, we do not have perpendicular lines. Those two go hand in hand. If you write right angle as an attribute, you have to have perpendicular lines as an attribute as well. Okay, let's move on to trapezoid. It's really important that you're able to list all the attributes of these shapes because you will have an assessment later that has these exact shapes on it. So if you watch the video, you can always refer back to the video. You should do really well on the assessment. Okay, so on a trapezoid, trapezoids have 4 sides, which tells me that they are quadrilateral. We're going to look at that later on this week. These lines go on and on and on forever. They go on forever both ways, so you kind of have to visualize that. So let's look at angles first. Does the trapezoid have any acute angles? Well, this bottom right-hand corner and left-hand corner are both acute angles. So I know that it does have at least one acute angle. Remember, an acute angle is really cute. It's tiny. It's smaller than 90 degrees. I know that this is not, that it's smaller than 90 degrees because if I draw this in here to make 90 degrees, a perfect corner, it is less than that. See that? Okay, so what about obtuse angle? Well, it looks like these two angles are obtuse angles. So I'm going to put at least one obtuse angle. And there are no right angles. There are no perfect corner pieces in our trapezoid. So we would not write that down. All right, let's go on to lines. Doesn't have any parallel lines. Well, when I drew this in, it does have parallel lines. Set of parallel lines. Okay, what about intersecting lines? Well, there is obtuse and acute angles, so we know that there are intersecting lines. And the last kind of line is a perpendicular line. There are no 90-degree angles, so we know that there are no perpendicular lines. Now the triangle. Now this triangle is the same size. All the sides are the same size, okay? Just a fancy term for that is called an equilateral triangle. That one's easy to remember because equilateral sounds like equal. All the sides are equal. I know that there's 180 degrees in a triangle, and 180 divided by 3. Well, think, what's 18 divided by 3? What times 3 gets you 18? 6. So you know, add another 0, 60 degrees. These are all 60-degree angles. Well, you know anything less than 90 degrees is an acute angle. So you can go ahead and put 3 acute angles. No obtuse angles, no right angles. All of your angles are acute. Now let's go to the different types of lines. Parallel lines. Well, these lines all are going to cross. In a triangle, a typical triangle, you're not going to see any parallel lines. Okay? So if it asks you on a triangle, are there any parallel lines? No, there's not. Closed figure and 3 sides. So it's hard to have a set of parallel lines. Okay, I'm going to rotate this. Okay, what about intersecting lines? There's a lot of intersecting lines, so that's for sure in there. Right here is a set of intersecting lines. And then perpendicular lines. If there's not a 90-degree angle, there's no perpendicular line, so that would not be an attribute that we put. It kind of looks like a teepee now. Okay, so there's 3 acute angles and intersecting lines. That would be our attribute of a triangle. And the last shape that we're going to look at is a right triangle. That's a type of triangle. Why do you think it's called a right triangle? Well, if you look, it has a right angle on it, a 90-degree angle. So that automatically sends a red flag to me on some different attributes that it should have. Rotate this. Okay, so let's go through the different types of angles. Does it have a right angle? It does, because it's called a right triangle. So I'm going to go ahead and write. Let's write one right angle, and that is this angle right here. It's 90 degrees. It looks like a corner. Does it have any acute angles? Well, just so you know, every single triangle has to have at least 2 acute angles. So if you see a triangle, acute angles is always, always, always an attribute of it. So we can write 2 acute angles. There are no obtuse angles. And when it comes to the acute angles, you know that this is 90 degrees. 180 minus 90 is 90. So you know that these 2 angles would be 45 degrees, because 90 divided by 2 is 45. Okay, let's move on to lines. Are there any parallel lines? Remember, there aren't parallel lines in a triangle, so we wouldn't write that in. Intersecting lines. There are definitely intersecting lines. And we know with that right angle comes perpendicular lines. And those would be my 4 attributes when it comes to angles and lines that I would write for a right triangle. So what are you going to be doing today? Well, the first thing that I want you to do is I want you to do a lesson on Zern. You're going to continue to look at geometry on Zern. Remember, Wednesdays and Thursdays are our Zern days. So number 1, Zern. Number 2, you're going to watch this video and finish the Ed puzzle on it. And then number 3, you will have a quiz for NTI Day 26. It's going to ask you to label angles and identify different types of lines. And then it'll ask you to identify different attributes of shapes. Remember, in the parentheses, it'll say mark 3 that apply. So there's no reason when I go through your quiz that you only mark 2 on this question. Read the question all the way through. It tells you how many attributes that this exact shape would have. Okay? If you have any questions, make sure that you let me know. Hope you guys have a great afternoon.